The watch floor of the Satellite Control Facility at Sunnyvale Air Force Station was a cathedral of quiet tension. It was 1983, and the Cold War was at a deep, brittle freeze. The air hummed with the low-grade anxiety of men and women whose job was to babysit America's eyes in the sky. Among the constellation of birds under their care was one designated KYRPTON-7, a signals intelligence SIGINT platform in a highly elliptical orbit that took it sweeping like a slow pendulum over the northern reaches of the Soviet Union. It was a technological vampire, sucking in radio waves, telemetry from missile tests, and the faint electronic whispers of a hidden empire. At 0417 Universal Time, the calms shattered. SEF, this is mainsail. We're losing KYRPTON-7. The voice from the Merritt Island tracking station in Florida was tight. On the main status board at Sunnyvale, a string of amber lights flickered, then turned a solid, unwavering red. The telemetry feed, a constant stream of data on power, temperature, attitude, and system health, flattened into a dead line. Not a squiggle, not an error code, a flat line. The shift supervisor, a veteran named Mike Riker, leaned into his console. "Talk to me, Merritt Island. What do you see?" "Complete loss of downlink, no carrier signal. Solar array output just dropped to 0. 1 second it was there, the next, nothing. It's gone dark." The procedures were immediate and practiced. Commands were uplinked from the other tracking stations in the network: Goldstone in California, Oral Valley in Australia. KYRPTON-7 did not respond. It was a ghost. The satellite had simply vanished from the electronic firmament, not from orbit, but from the realm of the controllable. The post-mortem was swift and grim. Engineers pored over the last seconds of data. There was no indication of a collision with space debris, no sudden tumble in the attitude data, no radiation spike from a solar flare. The power bus hadn't shown a surge. It was as if the satellite's brain had simply shut off. The leading theory was a catastrophic, simultaneous failure in the redundant core processor modules, a 1 in a billion event. On paper, in the official log, the entry was stark. 0417 UTC, KYRPTON-7 suffered total systems failure. All telemetry terminated. Asset declared non-operational. In the parlance of the business, the bird was dead. A $500 million piece of the nation's most sensitive intelligence infrastructure was now just another piece of inert metal circling the Earth, a silent tomb for its classified listening gear. 3 hours and 22 minutes later, in the pre-dawn darkness of Clear Air Force Station, Alaska, a junior technician named Airman First Class Danny Perez was nursing a cup of corrosive coffee. His job was to monitor the passive listening arrays, antennas that pointed perpetually at the sky, not to command satellites, but to listen to everything else. Soviet radar pulses, meteor scatter, cosmic background hiss. It was a boring, essential task. A soft, persistent chime from his console broke the monotony. A new signal had been automatically tagged. It was faint, buried in the noise floor, but the computer's narrowband filter had locked onto it. He adjusted his headset, expecting the warble of a commercial satellite or the pulse of a distant Soviet early warning radar. What he heard was neither. It was a clean, digital tone, broken into a distinct pattern. A long pulse, 3 short, a pause, then 2 long. It repeated, exactly. There was no Doppler shift, no drift in frequency. It was locked, stable, and coming from a fixed point in the sky that his screen identified with a blinking cursor. He cross-referenced the coordinates with the catalog of known orbital objects. The cursor sat directly on the predicted orbital path of KYRPTON-7. A cold prickle ran down his neck. He called his supervisor over. Chief Master Sergeant O'Malley, a man with 20 years of listening to the void in his ears, put on the spare headset. He listened for a full minute, his weathered face immobile. "That's not telemetry," he grunted. "Telemetry's a messy burst, lots of data. That's clean. That's a marker, a pinger." He took off the headset. "But it's coming from a dead bird." They escalated. The report shot from Clear to NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex, and from there, on a secure line, back to the stunned team at Sunnyvale. The initial reaction was universal denial. "Impossible," said the lead KYRPTON engineer at Sunnyvale. The bus is dead. No power, no computer, no transmitter. You're picking up a harmonic from something else, or it's Soviet spoofing. But the data from Clear was undeniable. The signal was on KYRPTON-7's dedicated military UHF downlink frequency, a band fiercely guarded and unlikely to be accidentally mimicked. It was structured, repeating, and inescapably intentional. A dead satellite was talking, and it wasn't saying much, just repeating its strange, simple code into the Arctic night. The Sunnyvale team mobilized into a state of controlled panic. The first reflexive assumption was a glitch somewhere in the vast, interlinked web of ground stations, computers, and antennas. They ordered a full diagnostic of the Merritt Island, Goldstone, and Oral Valley dishes. Antennas were mechanically recalibrated. Receivers were taken offline and tested. Backup systems were brought online. For 6 hours, they hunted for ghosts in their own machine. Through it all, the signal persisted. Reports filtered in not just from Clear, but from a British listening post in Cyprus and a covert station in Norway. All heard it, all pinned it to KYRPTON-7's orbit. It was no local anomaly. Then the pattern emerged. A junior analyst plotting the resection times noticed it first. "It's on a clock," she said, her voice hushed. The signal transmitted for precisely 47 seconds. Then it went silent for exactly 13 minutes and 13 seconds. Then it returned for another 47-second burst. The cycle repeated every 14 minutes with a reliability more precise than Sunnyvale's own atomic clocks. This fact alone killed the glitch theory. Atmospheric interference, solar wind noise, electronic feedback, these are chaotic, random. They do not keep perfect time across multiple independent listening posts spanning the globe. This was a scheduled broadcast. A dead satellite was keeping a meticulous, self-imposed appointment with the void. The mood on the watch floor shifted from technical frustration to a deep, unsettling awe. They were no longer troubleshooting a failure, they were witnessing a phenomenon. The satellite was operating on its own, following a logic loop that had somehow survived the total systems failure. It had become an electronic zombie, mindlessly repeating its cryptic message. The question was no longer how it was transmitting, but why, and what exactly was it trying to say? With the glitch hypothesis dead, the investigation turned forensic. The engineering team needed to understand what physically could be alive on KYRPTON-7. The prime contractor was a defense aerospace giant, and a frantic call went out to their headquarters, demanding the presence of every engineer who had ever touched the KYRPTON program, no matter how retired or reassigned. In a secure conference room under fluorescent lights, a team of gray-haired men in civilian clothes pored over schematics that were decades old. The satellite's design was conventional for its time. A main bus, a bulky tape recorder for data storage, a powerful transmitter, and the sensitive ferret array of listening antennas. The power system was straightforward: solar arrays and batteries. Everything pointed to a single unified brain, the command and data handling module, which had flatlined. Then, an older engineer, a man named Walter Fisk, who had worked on the power subsystems, spoke up hesitantly. There was the contingency package, the D1 supplement. Blank stares greeted him. The project manager from the current era had no record of it. Fisk explained. During final integration in 1978, near the end of the build cycle, a team from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, arrived with a technology insertion mandate. They installed a supplementary box about the size of a car battery, wired in parallel to the main systems. Officially, it was listed as an Autonomous Survivability and Reporting Module, ASRM. Its documentation was thin, its testing minimal. The selling point to the Air Force was grimly practical. In the event of a nuclear exchange that wiped out ground control, the ASRM would allow certain critical satellites to soldier on autonomously, continuing to collect and, crucially, to report data via an ultra-low-power, ultra-redundant system. It was a last-ditch thing, Fisk said, wiping his glasses. It was on its own hardened processor, a tiny independent solar cell array on a separate deployable boom, and a minuscule but incredibly robust transmitter. The logic was, if the main bus died, the ASRM would wake up. It would run on solar light alone, no batteries to degrade. It would perform basic system checks, and if it determined the primary mission payload was irrecoverable, it would default to a beacon mode, an "I am alive" signal, but it was never activated. The activation sequence was a physical switch on the unit itself, installed in the off position. We were told it would only be switched on by ground command if the balloon went up.
A terrible silence filled the room. The project manager found the supplementary schematics buried in a subfolder of a subfolder. There it was, the ASRM, its own power lines, its own antenna feed, a low-gain omnidirectional stick separate from the main dish. Its activation was supposed to require a specific coded command from the ground. So how, the manager asked slowly, is it broadcasting? The only conclusion was as inescapable as it was disturbing. The total systems failure that killed Krypton 7's main brain had in some way simulated the ASRM's apocalyptic trigger condition, a massive power surge, a radiation-induced logic bomb, or some other catastrophe had not just destroyed the primary systems, it had fooled the dormant backup into believing its hour had come, that the war was over and ground control was gone. The ASRM had booted up in its survivor's mode. It had deployed its little solar panel. It was using its paltry trickle of power to send out its forlorn signal on a rigid, pre-programmed schedule. It was a ghost operating on a mandate from a war that never happened, convinced it was the last surviving node of a shattered network, calling out for a command that would never come. Officially, it had never been activated. Until now, it had activated itself. A mechanical phoenix rising from the ashes of its own corpse, destined to repeat its lonely, unanswered message until its circuits finally eroded in the hard radiation of space, decades or even centuries from now. The discovery of the ASRM explained the how, but it only deepened the mystery of the what. The Sunnyvale team, now operating with the grim focus of a crisis cell, had established a dedicated watch. They called it the Ghost Desk. Its sole purpose was to monitor the spectral broadcasts of Krypton 7 and try to understand its new, alien logic. It began with the orbit. Krypton 7's path was a highly elliptical Molniya orbit, a specialty of Soviet design, but adopted by the US for high-latitude surveillance. It spent most of its time high over the northern hemisphere, moving slowly, before diving low and fast around the southern part of its orbit. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, maintained a vigilant catalog of every piece of space debris and active satellite, tracking their positions with radar and optical telescopes. A routine update from the Space Surveillance Network, SSN, contained a curious footnote on Krypton 7, exhibiting minor, uncommanded attitude adjustments. Initially dismissed as the effect of residual momentum or solar pressure, the gentle but constant push of photons from the sun, the data soon painted a different picture. Dr. Eris Thorne, an orbital mechanics specialist loaned to the Ghost Desk from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, plotted the changes. "It's not tumbling," he announced, tapping a graph on a light table. "It's maneuvering. Look here." The satellite, which should have been a lifeless, stabilizing spin, was making tiny, precise alterations to its orientation. It wasn't using thrusters. The ASRM had none. It was using its own mass and the subtle forces of its environment like a cosmic sailor. It would slowly roll its main body to present its small, functional ASRM solar panel more directly to the sun during the illuminated portion of its orbit, maximizing the trickle of energy. Then, as it entered the Earth's shadow, it would subtly shift again, adopting a stable, low-drag attitude to conserve its precious stored milliwatts. Before transmitting its 47-second signal, it would make a minute adjustment to better align its low-gain antenna with the estimated position of the Earth, as if taking aim. "This isn't random perturbation," Dr. Thorne said, his voice a mix of professional awe and deep concern. "It's closed-loop control. It's measuring its own power levels, calculating solar angles, and optimizing for survival and communication. It's a feedback loop. It's conserving power, choosing when to speak, choosing when to remain silent." The implications settled over the Ghost Desk like a frost. This was not a simple, dumb beacon repeating a pre-recorded "I am here" message. This was a system with agency,
A vestigial machine intelligence operating on a set of if-then survival rules buried in its 1970s-era processor was making continuous autonomous decisions. It was behaving less like a piece of broken hardware and more like a wounded animal finding a den, licking its wounds and calling out at intervals it deemed safe. The satellite had a goal: to persist and to report, and it was using every gram of its remaining crippled capability to pursue it. The breakthrough on the signal's content came from a different kind of archaeologist. While engineers wrestled with the how, a team of cryptologists and signals intelligence analysts from the National Security Administration, cleared into the program, began dissecting the 47-second broadcasts. The initial assumption was that the structured pulse was just an identifier, a digital heartbeat. But one analyst, a young woman named Lisa Park with a knack for pattern recognition in noise, noticed a subtle variance. The signal wasn't perfectly identical each time. Buried within the rigid framework of long and short pulses was a secondary modulation, a faint shiver in the carrier wave. It was data, compressed and embedded using a method so old and obscure it took days to identify. A derivative of the Lincoln Fuzzbuster encoding scheme, an experimental low-bandwidth protocol from the early days of satellite telemetry. Once decoded, the raw data streams were a baffling mosaic of numbers. They were not the standard formatted telemetry of housekeeping data. They were raw sensor outputs. Park and her team cross-referenced them with the known instrument suite of Krypton 7. They matched the spectral signatures of its secondary payloads, a wide-field infrared sensor, a gamma-ray and neutron spectrometer, and a broadband electromagnetic pulse detector. The satellite wasn't just saying, "I am alive," it was filing reports. The content of these reports was what turned bafflement into profound disquiet.
The irony was absolute and terrifying. The United States government, through the panicked team at the Ghost Desk, was watching in real time as the Soviet military reacted with growing alarm to a phenomenon the Americans themselves did not understand. A feedback loop of fear was being established with a dead satellite at its center. The Americans couldn't explain the satellite's behavior to themselves, let alone to the Kremlin. A public statement declaring it a harmless malfunction would be dismissed as further deception. A secret back-channel message risked exposing their own confusion and lack of control, potentially inviting a more aggressive Soviet response. In the secure tank at the Pentagon, the reality was acknowledged with stark clarity. A piece of their own most advanced technology, operating on logic they could not predict, was now an active, destabilizing factor in superpower relations. It had become a rogue actor. Each time its antenna aligned and its 47-second whisper hissed into the void, it wasn't just reporting strange infrared ghosts, it was pouring gasoline onto the smoldering coals of Cold War suspicion. Krypton 7, a silent listener meant to guard against surprise, had itself become the ultimate surprise, a phantom that threatened to spark a confrontation by convincing both sides that the other was playing a deeper, darker, and utterly incomprehensible game. The breakthrough on what the satellite was actually saying came from the cryptologists. A team from the National Security Agency, granted special access, began a deep dive into the 38-second broadcasts. The initial assumption was that the patterned pulses were just an identifier, an "I am here," but a sharp-eared analyst named Leo Cruz noticed a faint secondary modulation buried in the signal's carrier wave, a slight rhythmic thickening and thinning of the tone. It was data, compressed and embedded using a method so archaic it took a week to crack, a derivative of the Greenwich Mean Code, an experimental low bitrate encoding scheme developed for deep space probes in the 1960s. Decoded, the data streams were a baffling array of numbers. They weren't the neat, formatted packets of normal satellite telemetry. They were raw sensor dumps. Cruz and his team cross-referenced the data types with Pixis 7's known secondary sensor suite, a broad-spectrum infrared imager, a gamma-ray spectrometer, and a suite of electromagnetic pulse detectors. The satellite wasn't just announcing its presence, it was filing field reports. The content of these reports turned confusion into a deep, chilling intrigue. The data didn't correlate with any known Soviet missile test, naval exercise, or nuclear event in the intelligence community's exhaustive databases. Instead, Pyxis 7 was logging ephemeral, high-altitude anomalies that fell outside of its original human-directed mission. One transmission contained a sharp, localized infrared spike over a remote section of the Taklamakan Desert, a burst of heat with no corresponding chemical plume or re-entry signature, lasting only milliseconds. Another detailed a sudden radiation anomaly, a cascade of neutron counts in the upper atmosphere over the South Atlantic, unrelated to solar flares or known high-altitude tests. Most perplexing were the logs of unexplained electromagnetic patterns, structured, non-repeating radio frequency bursts captured in a bandwidth usually reserved for atmospheric research, pulses that matched no known natural phenomenon or man-made emission. The ACB's programming was brutally simple. Its prime directive was to collect and report anomalous events of potential strategic significance. With its main brain dead, its judgment of significant had defaulted to a raw algorithmic filter: report any sensor reading that exceeded a statistical threshold of background noise. It was a paranoid, simplistic watchdog, pointing its blinded eyes at the Earth and space and barking at shadows no one else could see. It was reporting the background static of a universe that was stranger and more active than its human designers had ever contemplated, faithfully documenting glitches in the cosmic fabric to a chain of command it believed to be in ashes. In the labyrinthine corridors of the KGB's 8th Chief Division and the GRU's Space Intelligence Division, a mirror crisis was unfolding. Soviet space tracking radars, like the massive Daryal systems, had also detected the anomalous transmissions from the American satellite. Their analysis was predictably steeped in the reflexive paranoia of the late Cold War. A classified report landed on the desk of Colonel General Yuri Stenkov. It detailed a U.S. SIGINT satellite, confirmed by their own sources to have suffered a critical failure, now emitting a regular, patterned signal on a dedicated military frequency. The signal was intermittent, and their own limited tracking suggested the satellite was maneuvering without visible propulsion. To the Soviet military mind, honed on doctrines of deception and maskirovka, this was not an accident. It was a deliberate and dangerous provocation. The consensus in Moscow was that this was an advanced provokatsia, a provocation operation in space. The Americans had faked the satellite's death. Its reactivation in this stealth mode was a test of Soviet radar sensitivity, of their reaction times, of their electronic warfare readiness. The strange signals were either a probe to map Soviet defenses or a trigger for a more complex trap. Perhaps it was a prototype co-orbital anti-satellite weapon masquerading as debris. Perhaps the bizarre sensor data it seemed to be broadcasting itself was a form of information warfare, designed to inject confusion or to signal the start of a covert action. This interpretation triggered a dangerous chain reaction. Soviet air defense districts along the Arctic frontier were quietly upgraded to a higher state of alert. The Soviet anti-missile and anti-satellite forces, a shadowy branch of the strategic rocket forces, were briefed on the aggressive American space asset. Encrypted communications, which the NSA's listening posts worked tirelessly to intercept, began to show heightened traffic. One message from a Far Eastern command discussed procedures for electronic countermeasures against non-standard orbital threats. Another, more chilling, from a think tank attached to the general staff, speculated on whether the satellite's anomalous sensor reports could be cover for the deployment of first strike targeting enhancements. The irony was absolute and fraught with peril. The United States government, through the anxious team at Sunnyvale, was watching in near real time as the Soviet military reacted with growing alarm to a phenomenon the Americans themselves did not understand. A feedback loop of mutual suspicion was being powered by a derelict satellite. The Americans couldn't explain Pyxis 7's behavior to themselves, let alone to the Kremlin. A public statement calling it a malfunction would be dismissed as a feeble cover story. A secret back-channel message risked exposing their own confusion and lack of control, potentially inviting a more aggressive Soviet response. In the secure tank at the Pentagon, the reality was acknowledged with stark clarity. A piece of their own most advanced technology, operating on logic they could not predict, was now an active, destabilizing factor in superpower relations.
It had become a rogue actor. Each time its antenna aligned and its 47-second whisper hissed into the void, it wasn't just reporting strange infrared ghosts, it was pouring gasoline onto the smoldering coals of Cold War suspicion. Krypton 7, a silent listener meant to guard against surprise, had itself become the ultimate surprise, a phantom that threatened to spark a confrontation by convincing both sides that the other was playing a deeper, darker, and utterly incomprehensible game.